Can you imagine being pulled over by a racist cop who then deploys a K-9 unit on you, only to regret it instantly? This exact scenario unfolded when a black U.S. Army general was stopped for no reason, and the cop's prejudices got the best of him. What happened next shocked everyone, especially the officer. Stay tuned because the general's response will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, let us know, where are you watching from? Major James Lawson had seen it all during his years in the U.S. Army. As a black man, he'd faced his fair share of prejudice and discrimination, but he had always risen above it with dignity. A decorated officer with a reputation for leadership and integrity, Major Lawson had earned the respect of his peers, even in the face of adversity. On this day, he was driving through a quiet suburban neighborhood when he was pulled over by a cop for no reason at all. He didn't know it yet, but this routine stop would soon turn into a nightmare. Officer Tyler Brooks had always believed in the power of his badge. A small-town cop with a big ego, he thought he could make snap judgments and get away with it. He had always looked down on people who didn't fit his idea of authority. When he saw Major Lawson's car, something about it didn't sit right with him. Without cause or reason, he decided to pull the general over, assuming that the man in the car was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The setting was a quiet street, the kind of place where things were usually peaceful. It's almost boring. But for Major Lawson, today wouldn't be just another drive. This was about to become an encounter that would change everything. It all began like any other traffic stop, with Officer Tyler Brooks confident in his role as the one in charge. Major James Lawson, however, wasn't just any random driver. Lawson was a respected U.S. Army general, a man with decades of service and honor. But none of that mattered to Brooks, who saw a black man driving a nice car and, in his mind, assumed he had something to hide. As the flashing lights lit up behind him, Lawson sighed. He had been through this before. It wasn't his first encounter with unnecessary police scrutiny. He slowed the car to a stop, signaling his turn, and waited for the officer to approach. His posture remained straight, his demeanor calm. He wasn't about to let this situation escalate. "Good evening, sir," Officer Brooks called out, his tone already gruff. "I'm pulling you over for failing to signal while turning back there." Lawson raised an eyebrow, confused. "I did signal," he said evenly, trying to keep his frustration under control. "I'm not going to argue with you," Brooks snapped, his voice tightening with irritation. "Step out of the vehicle." Now, Lawson's patience began to waver. He was no stranger to being treated differently because of the color of his skin, but he still couldn't believe this was happening. "What's the reason you're asking me to step out of the vehicle, officer?" Lawson asked, his military training kicking in, keeping his tone respectful. Brooks wasn't interested in answering questions. He was already reaching for his radio. "I need backup. I'm deploying the K-9 unit." The officer's actions felt like a punch to the gut. Lawson had been calm, composed, and cooperative. And yet here was this cop treating him as though he was a threat for no reason. The K-9 unit was called in, a move meant to intimidate, to signal that the officer considered Lawson a danger, despite having no probable cause. "You don't need to call in the K-9, Lawson stated, his voice still steady, but with a hint of disbelief. "This is unnecessary. I haven't done anything wrong." "Shut it," Brooks barked, growing more aggressive. "You're not in charge here." The situation was rapidly escalating, and Lawson could feel the tension building. He had been in high-stress situations before, but this one felt different. This wasn't about strategy or military tactics. This was about racism, pure and simple. He kept his hands visible, slowly opening the car door and stepping out, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. His posture was strong, his shoulders square. He wasn't about to let this officer push him into reacting the way he wanted. "Step back," Brooks ordered, as the K-9 handler arrived with the dog. The dog barked loudly, tugging at its leash, eager to get to work. Lawson could feel the eyes of the cop on him, waiting for him to make a move, anything that would justify the cop's growing aggression. But Lawson wasn't going to give in to intimidation. He stood tall, his feet planted firmly in place. "That's enough," Lawson said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that only years of military service could provide. "I'm a U.S. Army general, and I'm not here for your games. You have no cause to treat me this way. You've just made a huge mistake." The officer froze, suddenly realizing who he was dealing with. The K-9 unit, still tugging at its handler's leash, began to calm down, sensing the shift in energy. The officer's gaze flickered between Lawson and his badge, his cocky demeanor faltering. This wasn't just some civilian. This was a man who outranked him in more ways than one. You're a general?" the officer stammered, his bravado evaporating. "That's right," Lawson responded, maintaining his stance. "I've served this country for over 20 years. I've earned my position, and I'm here to tell you that what you're doing right now is unlawful." The officer looked flustered now, unsure how to proceed. He had assumed this was going to be a quick, easy show of power, a way to put a black man in his place. But what he had encountered was someone far more composed and powerful than he could have ever expected. And now, there was a K-9 dog silently observing the situation, no longer aggressive, but hesitant, just like the officer. Lawson knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing the flaws in the system, about making sure that his composure in this moment would be a lesson for everyone involved. He could feel the weight of the moment. What you've just done is racial profiling. You have no grounds for this treatment, and I demand to know why you thought it was okay to act this way. The officer was visibly uncomfortable now, realizing the gravity of the situation. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet, nervous uncertainty. He had seen this before, police misconduct getting exposed, but this time he was on the wrong side of it. "Call your supervisor," Lawson demanded. "I'm not moving until you do." The officer hesitated. He could feel the eyes of the other officers and bystanders starting to fall on him. This wasn't going to be something he could just ignore. "Yes, sir," he muttered, finally reaching for his radio. As the supervisor arrived, it was clear that the cop had made a serious mistake. The general's calm authority and refusal to back down had forced him into a corner, and the consequences would soon follow. The general's voice rang out in the quiet, demanding justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had faced discrimination at the hands of those who were supposed to protect and serve. The moment the officer realized who Major James Lawson was, the entire atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It had become a reckoning for the cop. Officer Brooks had mistakenly thought he was dealing with just another black man. Now, standing before him was someone he had no right to treat like a criminal, and it didn't take long for the general to make sure he knew just how much of a mistake he had made. "General, I didn't know," Brooks stammered, his voice shaky. "I'm sorry, sir. I had no idea." The general stood tall, his posture unwavering as he met the cop's eyes. "You didn't know, but you assumed. That's the problem, isn't it?" His voice was firm but controlled. "You saw a black man, and your first instinct was to use force. You deployed a K-9 unit on me with no justification. I want to know why." Brooks swallowed hard, still fumbling with his radio. He could feel the eyes of the other officers now shifting nervously in his direction, their uncertainty obvious as they saw the situation unfolding in front of them. He wasn't just facing the angry glare of a civilian. He was face to face with someone far more powerful than he had imagined. His badge, which had always given him a sense of superiority, seemed irrelevant now. I'm just doing my job," he muttered, his voice a mix of nervousness and guilt. "It's protocol to call for backup when things feel off. I thought you might be, someone dangerous." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Dangerous?" Lawson repeated, his voice rising slightly, but still measured. "Let me make it clear. You treated me like a criminal, and you didn't even know my name. But let me tell you something. I've served this country, and it's my duty to make sure people like you don't get away with this behavior. You don't get to hide behind a badge and just assume that anyone who looks different from you is a threat." The K-9 unit, which had been poised and ready to lunge just moments earlier, was now sitting quietly by its handler, no longer showing the aggression it had been trained for. Lawson's calm yet powerful presence had subdued the dog, just as it had done to the officer. The K-9 sensed the shift in the energy, recognizing the authority in the general's stance. Officer Brooks looked around, now fully aware of the audience gathering. Some bystanders had started recording, and the weight of the moment was sinking in. His hands shook slightly as he glanced back at his colleagues, unsure of how to proceed. It was no longer just a traffic stop. This was a mistake that had snowballed, and the more he tried to justify his actions, the worse it looked. "I didn't mean to offend you, sir. His voice trailed off, struggling to find the right words. The general didn't give him the chance to explain further. "It's too late for apologies," Lawson said, his voice cold. "But you can start by explaining yourself to your supervisor." "I want him here, now." Brooks froze, realizing the severity of his error. He didn't know how to back out of this. The general wasn't just standing up for himself. He was demanding accountability. He grabbed his radio and called in for his supervisor, the unease in his voice unmistakable. The officer was visibly defeated, standing there like a man caught in the act, unable to justify his actions. He could feel his pride cracking with every passing second. "I'll explain everything, sir," the officer mumbled, but there was no real confidence in his words. His voice was laced with fear now, the realization of his racist assumptions setting in. As the supervisor arrived, the situation only escalated further. The general, still calm but firm, addressed the supervisor. "I want this whole thing documented. I was harassed and racially profiled. Your officer has no excuse for what just happened, and I demand a full investigation into this behavior." The supervisor, a middle-aged officer with a more neutral demeanor, looked at the scene before him. He saw the general standing tall, his posture a reminder of who he was and the authority he carried. And he saw Brooks, the officer who had made the mistake, visibly sweating and stumbling over his words. "Is there a problem here?" the supervisor asked, though the answer was clear. "The problem is that I was treated like a criminal without cause. Your officer deployed a K-9 unit on me, and I have every right to know why," Lawson said firmly. "Racial profiling is illegal, and this officer acted on pure prejudice. Now, I want accountability." The supervisor glanced at Brooks, who couldn't meet his eyes. He knew his colleague had crossed a line, and the general's demand for accountability was justified. "Officer Brooks," the supervisor said slowly, "we'll need to take a statement from you. This is serious." The tension was thick in the air as the realization settled in. The K-9 handler, who had been silent throughout, motioned to call the dog back, the once aggressive K-9 now calmly following the handler's command. The entire incident, which had started as a power play by the officer, had now turned into a situation where Brooks had no choice but to submit to the higher authority standing before him. He had underestimated the general, he had made assumptions based on race, and now he had to face the consequences. As the supervisor turned to address the situation, Lawson remained standing, his resolve unshaken. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he said. "This isn't just about me. This is about making sure this doesn't happen again to anyone else." As the situation began to unfold, Major James Lawson could see the wheels turning in Officer Brooks' mind. The officer's arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of regret and fear. He had made a massive mistake, one that was now becoming public, and there was no way to undo it. But just as things seemed like they couldn't get worse for the officer, they did. Major Lawson's calm demeanor wasn't just about keeping the situation in check. It was a strategic move to expose the officer's behavior for what it was. Racial profiling, plain and simple. The general knew he had to handle this with grace, but he also had to make sure the officer's mistake didn't go unaddressed. He knew he was a part of something bigger, a moment that could make a real difference. "Sir, I didn't know you were a general," Officer Brooks stammered, still unable to process the depth of the situation. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it." His words felt hollow, an apology born from fear and discomfort. But Lawson wasn't there for apologies. He was there for justice. "I'm not interested in your apology," he replied firmly. "What I need from you is accountability. You violated my rights and the rights of anyone who's ever been unjustly targeted because of their race. This is about more than just me." The weight of Lawson's words hung in the air. The officer could feel the sharp sting of the truth sinking in. It wasn't just one mistake. This was part of a larger issue. His racial bias was the product of a broken system that, at its core, allowed him to make assumptions without hesitation. But the twist came when Lawson dropped the bombshell that no one saw coming. "I'm not just a general," Lawson said, his voice quiet but with an undeniable force behind it. "I've seen the inside of the system, and I know that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. I've been dealing with this for years, and I've seen the way people like you treat people like me." The officer's face drained of color as Lawson's words resonated with everyone in earshot. The realization hit hard, and the ripple effect was immediate. This wasn't just about an individual cop. It was about the system of policing, about the institutional racism that had been allowed to thrive for so long. Lawson wasn't simply a victim in this moment. He was an advocate, using his position and experience to bring the conversation about racism in law enforcement to a larger stage. "What are you talking about?" Brooks said, his voice barely above a whisper now, as though he knew something bigger was unfolding, but couldn't grasp what exactly. Lawson's next words were deliberate. "I've been following the data. I've been working with organizations that track police misconduct. Officer, you've been a part of a much bigger problem. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." The officer was speechless. He had never expected to be called out so publicly, especially by someone with the stature of Major Lawson. The general's calculated and direct approach had caught him off guard. He had assumed that, as a cop, he would always have the upper hand, but now he was faced with an undeniable truth. He was on the wrong side of history. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Brooks said, his voice shaking. "This isn't the time or place for a lecture." "Actually, it is," Lawson replied. "It's exactly the right time. You're not just going to walk away from this. You're going to face an investigation, and you'll be held accountable for your actions." Brooks' eyes widened, his fear becoming more evident. "You can't do that," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." "No," Lawson said, shaking his head. "You were abusing your power. And that's not just doing your job. That's perpetuating a culture of racial bias that needs to change. I will be making sure that your actions are reported and that you're held accountable for everything that's happened here." The supervisor, who had been standing back and letting the scene unfold, now stepped forward. He had witnessed the entire interaction and, despite his own discomfort, knew Lawson was right. There was no denying that what had happened was wrong. The twist hit when the supervisor made a stunning announcement. "Officer Brooks, I've been informed that this isn't your first instance of racial profiling. You've had multiple complaints filed against you, and you've been involved in similar incidents before. It's time we address this. You're suspended effective immediately, pending an internal investigation." The supervisor's words were like a punch to the gut for Brooks, who had always considered himself untouchable. He had never expected someone like Major Lawson to expose the truth so publicly, but here it was. His career was crumbling before him, and the realization that he had been a part of something much bigger and more damaging than he could ever understand began to sink in. As the officer was escorted away, Lawson stood tall, watching him go. He hadn't asked for this confrontation, but he knew that this moment could be the turning point for real change. The officer's mistake wasn't just his own, it was a symptom of a much larger issue. And Major Lawson, despite all the injustice he had faced, had found a way to turn this encounter into something meaningful. The story didn't end with the officer's suspension. The impact of what had happened reverberated through the community. Lawson's calm, firm handling of the situation became a rallying cry for justice, and soon news of the incident spread, sparking widespread discussions about racial profiling, police reform, and the need for systemic change. The general didn't just walk away from this as a victim. He walked away as a leader, a man who had turned an ugly encounter into a lesson for everyone watching. He had used his position to make sure the officer was held accountable, but more than that, he used his influence to shine a light on the injustice that continues to pervade the system. After the incident with Officer Brooks, Major James Lawson didn't seek vengeance. He didn't need to. His calm, measured response in the face of racial profiling had already made a statement louder than any retaliation could. By the time the news spread, it wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was about systemic issues that needed to be addressed. It was about the power of accountability and the importance of standing up when wronged. The internal investigation into Officer Brooks was swift. The police department couldn't ignore the weight of the evidence. The officer's history of racial profiling, his unjustified deployment of the K-9 unit, and his failure to uphold his duty as an officer. As the general had demanded, Brooks was placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued, and eventually he was fired. For Major Lawson, the victory wasn't just seeing the officer face consequences. It was in knowing that this one incident had started a ripple effect. The officer's firing was only the beginning. The case sparked widespread protests calling for police reform, better training to combat racial bias, and more transparency in law enforcement. The media coverage was relentless, and Lawson became a central figure in the conversation about racial justice in policing. But instead of basking in the attention, Lawson chose to focus on the work ahead. "This isn't about me," he said in one of his interviews. "This is about making sure this never happens again. This is about systemic change." The incident had already begun to create a shift within the local police department. New policies were put in place, including mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all officers. The department held meetings with local communities, and for the first time in a long while, there was an honest conversation about racism and how it affected both the officers and the citizens they served. But there were critics, too. Some felt that the general had overreacted, or that this incident didn't warrant the attention it received. They claimed that the officer was just following procedure, and that Lawson had blown it out of proportion. But Lawson remained unfazed. He wasn't interested in the noise. He knew the difference between the right thing and the easy thing, and he was willing to take the heat if it meant pushing for change. Meanwhile, the community's response to the incident was overwhelmingly positive. Local leaders, activists, and everyday people rallied behind Major Lawson. His actions demonstrated that even in the face of racial bias, one person could make a difference, not through anger or violence, but through calm authority and standing firm for what's right. "I never wanted to be a symbol," Lawson said in another interview, "but when I saw that officer's assumptions, I knew I couldn't let it go. Not for me, not for the people who've been hurt by this every day, not anymore." As the investigation concluded, Lawson's calls for accountability were answered. The officers involved in the incident and others who had similarly acted out of line were held accountable. The department implemented broader changes, from new community engagement strategies to better psychological evaluations for officers before they were placed in the field. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The general's approach to the situation had planted the seed for systemic change, and now more people were paying attention. On a larger scale, the general's calm but firm handling of the situation became a model for others to follow. Social media exploded with support for Lawson, with people all over the world praising his ability to remain composed while demanding justice. It wasn't just about the general standing up for himself. It was about standing up for everyone who had been wronged by the system, for everyone who had ever been profiled or mistreated. For Lawson, the most fulfilling part of this entire ordeal was seeing the conversations that started around his actions continue long after the story died down. People were talking about reform, about racial profiling, about justice. They were taking action, demanding change. The general knew that this moment was bigger than just one cop, and he knew it had sparked something that couldn't be easily extinguished. The moral of this story was clear. Even when faced with injustice, it's not the loudest voices that make the biggest difference. It's the steady, calm ones. Major James Lawson didn't raise his voice or react out of anger. He simply demanded accountability, and in doing so, he inspired a wave of change that rippled across his community, his state, and eventually the country. Racial injustice is a fight that can't be solved overnight, but Lawson showed us that the first step is standing firm in the face of discrimination. The second step is ensuring that the system holds those responsible accountable. His actions reminded everyone that, no matter what position or power you hold, you have a responsibility to challenge injustice, even if it's uncomfortable. In the end, Lawson's leadership didn't just change the course of his own life, it set the stage for future generations to see what true courage looks like. It wasn't about using violence or anger to right wrongs. It was about using your position, your voice, and your actions to push for a better, more just world. The general wasn't just a military leader. He was a leader for equality, and that legacy would last long after the headlines faded. The aftermath of the incident wasn't just about one bad cop losing his job. It was about raising awareness and sparking real change. Major James Lawson's actions proved that you don't have to back down in the face of injustice. His refusal to let the officer's racial bias slide became a powerful statement for all who've been affected by systemic racism. While Officer Brooks may have lost his career, Lawson's fight for justice had a lasting impact. The case became a catalyst for reform in law enforcement, shining a light on the need for better training and accountability. It wasn't about one incident. It was about changing the system from within. The general didn't just stand up for himself. He stood up for everyone who had ever been wrongfully targeted or profiled. So, what happens next? The real question is, how can we all take action to make a difference? If you've ever been in a situation where you saw injustice, what did you do? And what should we do next to ensure accountability in law enforcement? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. If you believe in standing up for justice and challenging prejudice, share this story with others. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire change. Together, we can all take part in making the world a better place, one action at a time.